Hey everyone, just doing a quick read through sort of description of the post. So this isn't going to be an exact read through, but we will discuss things as they go. So I just realized that I haven't updated this. So yeah, let's go through. So, our first little thing in here is, what is voice training? So voice training is the process whereby we sort of learn to modify our voices, and I just wanted to put a little bit of note in here, talking about the sort of contributions that we've seen when it comes to voice training. There's been a lot of people that have contributed to the field of voice, but the current models that are sort of up to date and sort of being used actively, they've mostly been codified by the trans voice team, trans voice lessons team. So Clover, Ziana, Vivian, all of them together kind of working to make things a little bit more put together, but of course there have been other outside influences on that as well. So let's dig in a little bit into the sort of features and things that we're sort of interested in when it comes to voice training. So the first side of things are basically what happens, what changes when bodies are exposed to hormones, right? So sex-linked aspects of voice, these are the sort of things that we're sort of looking at first here. So the main things we want to look out for when it comes to sex-linked aspects of voice are pitch. So that's basically how high or how low the voice is, right? In the post, we've got a little bit of a link to a tone generator here that you could take a look at, which basically just plays a tone and you can kind of get a feel for what it sounds like to be higher in pitch or lower in pitch. And as it says here, you might want to work on pitch matching. So it also does a little bit to explain the sort of ranges we expect. So for, the most typical of masculine voices, we're probably looking at 70 to 130 hertz, though, up to 170 hertz can probably work. Technically even higher depending on the exact mix of vocal sort of things. But if we're going for typical, we probably want lower pitch ideally. When it comes to more feminine voices, we're probably looking at 160 to 270 hertz as the average, and then obviously you've got outliers again. So pitch, how high or how low? Pretty high, relatively low, right? So vocal weight we can think of as the intensity of a voice, right? How soft versus how loud, how quiet versus how intense, all of this sort of thing. So a voice like this will be relatively soft, whereas one like this will be weightier, heavier sound. And there's a few different ways that can present. Another way of thinking about a kind of vocal weight scale would be something like so we've got some change there. And again, in this little category, we've got a little clip that will go over that as well. So resonance is a little bit of a confusing one sometimes, but we basically have to understand two things when it comes to resonance. So when we're talking about resonance in trans voice, we're generally thinking about changing the overall size presentation of the vocal tract, right? So we're thinking big space versus smaller space, right? That kind of gradient from small towards something that's getting bigger and then sort of back the other way, right? But when we're talking about this, we want to be mindful of the sounds we're getting out, because another thing that changes with resonance on a technical level is vowel sounds. So this is where vowel sounds are where we're most likely to interact with resonance on a day-to-day basis. So when you change the amount of space in your mouth or your throat, you basically are likely to change a vowel. And what we want to get the feel for is changing the space, but not changing the vowel sound we get out, because that's when we start seeing messy accents and things like that. Of course, if you're doing something deliberately to explore some sort of personality implying features or stylistic features, then that's fine. But generally speaking, if we're getting a feel for resonance, we want to be quite consistent with the vowels. So here's some more clips that you can look at and kind of explore this. As noted here, we want to think about the balance with other features in voice. So if your pitch or your vocal weight are too out of whack, you can start to get some weird things going on with this. So that's just something to keep in mind. If you're going for a more feminine voice, the main things to look out for are, if your pitch is too low, then it's hard to have a high resonance posture or like a small space without introducing extra like vocal weight or introducing roughness. And the other way that you can kind of have things in terms of pitch and mixing with resonances, your pitch can just go too high for the resonance and stuff can start to sound out of whack. With regards to vocal weight, they sort of interact with each other quite meaningfully. So if I make a big space but talk quietly, that sounds quite strange. If I make a big space and talk louder, that sounds a little bit more normal, right? So that's the, like, if we think big size, and those are kind of interactions we want to pay attention to. If we're thinking small size, then, you know, speaking softly is the ideal. But if we speak louder, then it can get yelly really, really quick, right? So that's something to look out for. And, you know, for transmasc folks, when we're thinking, or people looking to make their voices more masculine, we're sort of thinking the same things I said apply just now, but we're thinking, you know, pitch is a slightly bigger priority, just because so if I talk with a big space and the pitch is high and it's soft, then this doesn't sound supernatural. If I then kind of like go down in pitch while speaking relatively softly, this probably sounds like technically more typical than if I were to talk like this, right? So there's a little bit of kind of like juxtaposition between like what's passing TM and what's like natural, or what's like technically required to sound like masculine versus what sounds natural. So that's just something to think about. And then we sort of have the gender linked aspects of voice, so the garnish. But basically, if the previous stuff was the instrument we were playing on, or a sign of the instrument we're playing on, then the gender linked aspects are the way we play the instrument. This does break down a little bit, because obviously these factors are behavioural too, but these are all so stylistic factors we can think of as the way that a person's voice might differ from another person's voice. They might kind of indicate things like where you come from, or they might sort of like display varying degrees of kind of like masculinity or femininity. So let's go for an example for this. So I'm just going to conjure up in my head. This is probably diverged from the original person's clip, but that's fine. And don't get me wrong, I think that's vintage, right? Let's say that's our baseline clip. I could change around the sex-linked aspects of that, right? And keep some of the kind of like quirky speech patterns going on. And don't get me wrong, I think that's vintage. And don't get me wrong, I think that's vintage, right? We can change the sort of underlying stuff, but still have a person talking in a certain way. So to play around with gender link aspects, there's a lot of stuff like mimicry that can be really helpful and all of that kind of stuff, especially if you're not really sure where to go with it. So I've got another category here that's like the other stuff. This isn't as like concrete necessarily, but these are some things you might want to think about. Vocal warm-ups and looking after your voice is normally quite a good thing to think about. Another thing to think about would be not everything's like necessarily gender linked or like presentation linked, but can still have a vibe to it. So that might be things like your accent, and admittedly there is some link up between gender and accent, just because what we expect in one accent for one gender might be different to what we expect in another accent for a person's gender. But that's just things to think about. So yeah, there's a link to a video from Ziana here that talks a little bit about some stuff you can do if your voice is maybe not feeling tip top. Or you're a vocal hunter. I think that might be what's in that clip. So I think these are from me. These are just like some clips going over some of the stuff we already talked about and that you could maybe try talking about. And then here's a link to some ideas you could think about, or like some voices that you could examine to see if you vibe with any of the specific types of androgyny. So in this category, the table of contents here, you can just basically do Control F and like open bracket INT or TOC or RVC in the post and find the category you want to look at. So recommended voice communities, there's just some communities here where things like public lessons go on and things like that, so you can listen in and hopefully learn things from teachers as they go and talk to other students. Oftentimes when there's things like that, there's also time to talk to teachers afterwards, and in a number of these servers there's like events afterwards as well. Like OVC has some, I have some, Savvy doesn't right now, but might happen in the future. Linguistics has some events, and so does the Voice Out Project. And very, very occasionally the Trans Voice Lessons Discord does too. So here's some more sort of like resources you could explore. You're going to be wanting to look at the post to click on these, of course. But you know, these are quite self-explanatory. How to hear resonance better, how to improve the quality of your practice, how to hear things better. And there's a resource, a video here that's talking about voice surgery with one of the doctors that do that, which could be handy for people if they're thinking about it. Just as a personal note, I would recommend surgery not as your first port of call when it comes to voice stuff, just because outcomes can be a little bit on and off. And people don't always get what they want out of it. So make sure you're informed properly if you're going to go for voice surgery. So watching that video might be a good start. So here's some text-based resources you could look at. Sumi's Wiki, basically it's taken a ton of stuff from everyone and sort of like put it together and tried to provide a place to look at it. So that's the thing. Here's an old guide that I put together, which, I mean, it has some exercises in it, but I'd say it's relatively outdated, just in the sense that whilst the exercises still could be useful, like, there's better things to do as a first port of call. You'll find when you do a lot of stuff in voice training that, like, some things are kind of, like, better first starting points, I guess, than others, like seeing if you can try changing from like a yawny voice to a smaller voice without going through a whole exercise to do it, because if you don't need to rely on an exercise, you shouldn't necessarily do that. But you can use exercises to either explore further, right, like try and getting sounds that you've maybe not found through other methods, or you can use exercises if you're feeling stuck and you don't have anything to do. The same I'd say applies to Elle's guide. I feel it's a little bit sketchy at times. Romeo's guide, again, this one's for trans-mass people, but again, it's got some sketchy stuff in there, but it's also got useful stuff in there. So here's a post I made about getting started. I expect some of it's useful. I can't exactly remember what's in here. We could check, but we won't. So here's some teacher recommendations. Oh, there comes me. You can check me out if you want. Oh, and while we're here, sponsored lesson form. I don't think there's many slots left, or like there's many lessons in the pot right now, but sponsored lesson form, if you're like, oh my god, I can't afford any of these teachers, I can't get a lesson, then this might be a thing to consider, because this is here for people who can't afford lessons. So yeah, just a couple notes. These lessons are always public and the recordings are generally saved. You can opt out, but it's definitely encouraged. The reason being that other people can benefit from it that way. And if you have some spare time, money or whatever, then feel free to put some money in the pot for these sponsored lessons. That's always appreciated. So next up, also on the prices, this is accurate for me, but I'm not sure about everybody else, just because I don't keep a very, very, very tight track. So we have Flow Voice Studio, Dusty. This is what I last checked. They've got a website, they've got a Patreon. I'm not sure what the Patreon does exactly, but they do singing stuff as well as voice training. Celine, again, email, website, Discord, blah, 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 blah. Can speak in Spanish and Portuguese, but only teaches in English, but, you know, still could possibly be helpful if you are a primary Spanish, English, or Portuguese speaker, and also does singing as well. Savvy, very cool person, also does beatboxing lessons if you want that. Haven't checked the prices recently. Discord, there's previous lessons recorded and things like that you can take a look at. Got a Patreon, not sure. Savvy can teach in French, so that's quite useful. And I think she might do singing. I'm not super sure about that. I'm not sure how far that goes, but it might be like, you know, beginner trans voice stuff when it comes to singing. Again, we've got Clover, Zia, Vivian. I mean, I don't know about Vivienne because I've not really interacted with her, but Clover and Ziana are really good teachers, but they are quite expensive. But, you know, if you want the best, then those are probably pretty good options for you. They've got a website where you can book things. I think the waiting lists are relatively long, but I don't know exactly. Ziana's Patreon, you can use it to get into the Discord, and their YouTube channel has a bunch of resources which I'd recommend checking out. We've got Linguistics, we've got Charles, and we've got Ama. I think you can contact Ama for pricing. She might not be doing lessons right now, not 100% sure, and I think Charles is probably doing lessons right now. They have a server together. They're on. You can kind of go to public lessons and workshops and things. Ama has a Ko-fi. Charles has a Patreon. And the website doesn't let people book, but it's got like some potentially useful things on there. Then we have Sumi. I'm not sure if these prices are completely up to date because I think they might have changed recently. But yeah, we've got the website, we've got the Discord, all of this kind of stuff. Sumi's wiki from before, which is kind of a collation of everybody's stuff. But you know, did put it up there in a thing. So just vocal health stuff, some general tips you could follow, things like making sure you get enough sleep, staying hydrated, all of these kinds of things. You know, if you've got issues like acid reflux, those are the kinds of things you really want to kind of get a touch on. I'm not going to read this bit out loud just because it goes probably into more detail than you want, but the main takeaway I would say is that permanent vocal damage tends to be unlikely, but it's more likely if you have like long held onto bad vocal habits or health. So, you know, keep an eye out for like trying to avoid stuff if you can. And, you know, if your voice is feeling tired or rough, then give it a break and look after it. When I say give it a break, I don't mean like go cold turkey. I tend to mean like do some nice stuff with your voice, like vocal function exercises and some included vocal tract exercises. So these are just some like VFEs you could do. So vocal function exercises are just things that vocal function exercises are sort of like, they're basically vocal warm-ups. We kind of touched on vocal warm-ups further up the page, like near the start, but here's another more dedicated section talking about softies and things like that. Here's just a description of the graph that's just there. So swelling checks, they're another thing that you probably could do if you're a person that wants to do more than just speaking. Like if you want to do singing, they're probably quite useful. And I also linked here the false fold control text post from Ziana, because that's quite useful if you've so if you had like a persistent roughness in your voice, whether it's like something really, really intense like that, or if it's like something like this that's like more low-key, right? That would also be a sign of false fold constriction, and that post might be useful. False fold engagement tends to be pretty nasty for our voices. So next up, we have some tips and ideas to like deal with voice training at home or with family if we're worried that people are going to hear us and things like that. So these are some things that we can think about. So you can do some exercises quietly. So that's things like voiceless resonance manipulation. So that would be like if you picked up your phone and on your phone you played some white noise or something like that, and you use that to hear yourself playing with resonance. And you can get a feel for stuff like that. You know, you could play around with stuff that you can do while looking in the mirror and things like that. And then, you know, expanding pitch range if you're looking to make your voice masculine, that can be fairly quiet. Right? People aren't going to hear that from between rooms and things. And also practicing like soft sounds, like humming and things like that. If we're trying to feminize, yeah, that's a sentence. So Some exercises you can kind of like do quietly, like the ones we talked about above, but again, you do want to still find time to do things which aren't like just those. So here's some things you can try to sort of like to remove attention from yourself. So things like saying it's like voice acting, or saying it's for a D&D character, which I know are kind of the same thing but are a little bit different. Saying it's part of singing practice, or just pass it off as making noises for fun. The other options you can go for if you don't really have like places to practice, or you're worried about being noticed. So one option is going out for a walk and into open spaces, looking for places to practice. Another option would be things like, going into somewhere with like lots of stuff to dampen sound. So if you have a cupboard with like tons of clothes in it, people might not be able to hear you. If you're practicing like singing stuff or like shouting and things like that, then into a pillow can quiet things down quite a lot. Playing music or noise or anything like that in your room can help, but that can make it a little bit harder to practice because you're not hearing yourself as well. And another option would be sort of like practicing in the car. If you have a car, cars are really good soundproofing sort of like situation, so they can be pretty great. Ideally you want to be parked when doing this, because you don't want to have all your car noises making it harder to hear your own voice, or finding times when family just isn't around. So the next kind of topic takes up quite a lot of the post, or is the rest of the post. So it's sort of like things you might know, things you might not know, sort of section, things that could be helpful to know. So resonance is a messy term when it comes to voice training. Generally it has like a meaning in physics, but it also gets used to describe things like where people feel vibrations and stuff like that. When we're talking about voice training, I would try to stick to descriptions that either really like rigidly talk about acoustics, and they're like, this is your R1 value, blah blah blah, but I don't really don't recommend those as much as if people explicitly use it to refer to sound. So ideally they're also thinking about it in a scale from like low to high or big to small, right? Ideally we're thinking about it in that sort of vein. But yeah, some prompts that get thrown around are pretty weird when it comes to this, but just don't worry too much if you hear something completely crazy. It might just be a prompt that works for some people, but don't necessarily internalize it if people are like, feel the vibrations coming from your mouth or something, because that probably won't be like super transferable for everyone, or often many people. So falsetto is another messy term which gets used in like 12 different ways, but the main takeaway I think is that don't be afraid of using falsetto. It's not evil. It's just another way or state your voice can be in. Try to look past the like broad category that people call falsetto, and try to pay attention to like what things are going on in your actual voice, right? If I speak like this, what is going on? Right? Try to focus on like what's actually going on in your voice, rather than trying to like be like, oh no, falsetto's evil, I can't touch that. So for example, if I'm talking like this, I'm probably talking softer, I'm talking higher. If I'm talking like this and then I kind of like change resonance, then I was in a better spot, right? Don't necessarily run away from a configuration because it sounds falsetto-y, but maybe play around with trying to like fix it. So the next thing is just swallow and hold, and like manually trying to manipulate stuff like this. Don't try to push your larynx by touching it. Not useful, not helpful. Swallow and hold has a tendency to cause like muscle strain and other issues. I recommend avoiding them if you can, but I'd recommend avoiding them. So spectrograms and measuring apps, they have a place maybe, but they're generally not that useful. I probably want to update this paragraph. Pitch is a technically poor indicator by itself, but I wouldn't recommend using spectrograms necessarily, or like vocal monitors you can use them to double check would be my advice, but I wouldn't use them as like a primary source. Your ears are better to train, or more useful to train. If you have hearing issues, then the equation might be slightly different, but I don't have too much to add on that topic because I am not super experienced in working explicitly with people with hearing difficulties. So vocal fry and high larynx postures are harmful. These are basically just some SLP talking points which are kind of like garbage. Don't have much to say about that. They're sort of like based on some maybe inaccurate information or sort of like flawed assumptions. So next we have discussion of intonation, inflection, and prosody. Yeah, they're important, but they're on that sort of like stylistic, gendery side of thing, and don't replace working on the sort of like sex-linked characteristics. So here's another big one. There's this idea that you have to like use one voice, or you should be using one voice. It's not true. You can use lots of different voices. The only thing you need to be mindful of really is that voice is a little bit use it or lose it. So if you don't use a voice for a long time, then you might have trouble getting back to that configuration in the future. So that's just something to think about. So another thing to just talk about is smiling. So some people really implement smiling as part of their sort of like voice training stuff.
But, you know, it's not always appropriate to sort of be smiling. So, you know, we might want to practice sort of like trying different lip postures when we go for sort of like specific vibes of voice. So you could do something like look in the mirror when you do this, and just sort of like play with like, what if I like made my voice like more neutral, my mouth shape more neutral? What if I played with like more droopy lips and things like that? Can I still keep my like
size sounding appropriate, and sort of play around and practice with that? But it's also times when it's appropriate to smile. So don't be like, oh my god, I can't ever smile when doing anything with my voice. It's just you want to kind of like be aware that it's not always the most appropriate thing in the world. So here's another little post talking about the like the effects of sex hormones on voices. Basically, estrogen is sort of like testosterone, but like dialed back a ton. Probably won't do much if you've already been exposed to T, but if you've not gone through puberty yet, then it'll make a slight difference, making your voice sound a little bit deeper, a little bit sort of like larger space, and a little bit lower. Heavier, a little bit lower. Yeah, I said all the things. But that's just a sort of like first puberty situation. Second puberty, it doesn't really do much. And testosterone, generally things like testosterone and estrogen will have like more effects the sooner it happens, right? So if you are during your second puberty, depending on when you have testosterone, if you are looking to make your voice more masculine, things like growth plates are already fused and things like that, so you might not see the same degree of changes as a person who had a first testosterone puberty. So these are just things to keep in mind, but generally the main changes that we see from hormones are, so let's just talk about testosterone, and we can think of estrogen as sort of like a very dialed down version. Testosterone makes space bigger in the vocal tract, right? Expansion in the pharynx, lengthening of the vocal tract itself. Adam's apple, laryngeal prominence, this will get more visible, things like that. The vocal folds will get longer and they'll get thicker, so this has an effect on pitch and weight. So sounds will probably get like louder or heavier or buzzier, and they'll also go down in pitch. But everyone has different mileage when it comes to stuff like this. So and there's some sort of like conjecture from people like Dr. Powers who said that, lower doses of testosterone when starting may have like slightly different effects to like high doses when starting testosterone. So different thing, yeah. Mileage varies depending on a ton of environmental factors as well. So the next sort of post is just talking about trouble keeping voice where you want it. So there's a few ways you could practice this. One option is sort of like, you want to be somewhere. So let's say you're a trans guy and you want to make your voice lower. So what you can do is practice trending your voice in that direction. So I could start talking higher and then sort of over the course of a sentence move down in pitch. If I sort of get in a habit of kind of like trending in a direction, over time I'll probably start, speaking in a lower pitch. And the inverse is true if you're trying to make your voice higher. But another thing is to think about the weight you've got when you're doing this stuff. So this is especially relevant if we're thinking about higher pitches, but generally speaking, if you are at a high pitch, you need a sort of like lighter, quieter, softer, gentler approach to make it easy to stay at that pitch. So if I try to talk high but talk loud, it's more effortful than if I try to talk high and loud softly. My voice is a little bit betrayed today. My voice is feeling a little bit tired. So that's a little bit of the reason why I've got roughness. But generally speaking, it's easier to sustain a higher sound if you're softer. I'm clicking on things. So getting distracted. But yes, so is easier to maintain than just another thing to think about, right? So yeah, and then there's other things you can try, like asking other people to sort of like tell you if they notice you dropping, and sort of like practicing kind of changing things in your voice like a little bit and moving back.
So I might try talking like this and then sort of changing a little bit and then kind of moving back.
And if I can detect a change like that, then I'm probably going to be able to correct it because I noticed it's happening. So we're sort of like able to get a better feel for what our voice sounds like and when we change things up. So, the final thing here is just like, does anybody have any questions, any suggestions, blah, 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 blah. A little bit of a bump for the sponsored lesson form if people are looking for lessons. And, if you want to come and listen into any lessons in my server, then the link's here as well. So yeah, that's this post. Not going to go through the comments because I don't think there's anything new and fun in there. Woo, trans rights. But yeah, so I'm going to stop recording here, and hopefully that was handy to some people.